Hello, everybody. Welcome to Planet FPL, the world where everything revolves around Fantasy Premier League. My name's Suj.
And my name is James.
On certain days, it doesn't revolve around Fantasy Premier League. I need to think about the intro, change it, mix it up when it's not FPL, like today.
Revolves around, we could do that. Revolves around a World Cup that no one thinks should be happening. Maybe we should call it that.
I don't think no one thinks it should be happening. But we are now T-minus 6 days until Qatar 2020 kicks off. And we are going to have more and more of a focus around the World Cup, rightly so, whilst it's on over the next 4 weeks. I say rightly so. We could talk about other things, but I think we are going to be talking quite a lot about the World Cup. And today is a take on the human rights issues around Qatar 2020, and maybe a conversation, I would say, rather than any kind of investigative journalism around the situation with Qatar and why a lot of people are boycotting the World Cup, why a lot of people don't think it should be happening to start with, and the issues around all of that.
We're basically kind of splitting this into two different parts. The second one will be on Friday, where we're going to look more at the actual physical awarding by FIFA to give the tournament to Qatar back in 2010, the issues around the moving the tournament to winter, financial controversies, if we will. We're going to kind of park that, and on this podcast, we're going to look more at the human rights issues in Qatar going into this World Cup. Make people aware of what some of the issues are, because as I said to you, I think most people can identify and say, oh, there's human rights issues in Qatar, but actually ask the average person to define what that is. I'm not sure how clued up everyone is. I'm sure a lot of the listeners are, but some won't be. And I think it's important to kind of share what those issues are.
Yeah, I think that's a very fair comment, and I think the majority of the reporting that you will see on the news and on snippets and in kind of 6-8 minute YouTube clips is very high level. It doesn't really delve into the detail of it, but is very, very high level. And it's like there are human rights issues in Qatar, and so they shouldn't win it. From my point of view, I think they broadly fall into a few different categories, but also then the reasoning behind some of these human rights issues can also fall into three broader categories. To start with, you have the situation with LGBTQ rights, which is a problem. And we've seen all sorts of interesting things temper your behavior when you're in Qatar, and even our own government making statements like, follow their rules and what have you. That didn't go down particularly well. The government ended up walking back those comments. So obviously, the LGBTQ rights is an issue. Women's rights is a big concern, not just in Qatar, but across the Middle East. And we've seen the situation in Iran really
which we
boiling
discussed
over.
A couple of weeks ago.
Exactly that. You've got that. And then the third section is this kind of migrant worker problem in the whole of the Middle East. There are millions of workers doing blue-collar labour-related jobs that have come from the South Asian subcontinent, India, Pakistan, Bangladesh, Nepal, all of these kind of areas, like millions. You're talking, I think, between 14, 15 million workers in that region come from that area, and they have very restricted kind of working rights. So those are the three buckets that most people are looking at as these kind of human rights issues. If you take a step back, I also think, right, okay, well, what's the driver of these rules, regulations, laws, what are cultural norms? And some of the things are religious. So being an Islamic state, they have religious customs that they hold to. Some of them are cultural in the region, and then others are political. And I think we have to be very understanding of, is this a religious norm? Is this a cultural norm in the area? And is it a political, financial situation? And I really struggle with this, I have to be honest with you, because...
I think that's okay, by the way.
Yeah, the thing is, the World Cup was awarded in...
2010.
And there's 12 years that this is. In that intervening time, Qatar as a nation had been allowed to buy one of the biggest football clubs in Europe, in Paris Saint-Germain. And many will consider buying Messi and Neymar and so on sports washing. They sponsor Bayern Munich as well.
Is it Bayern?
Bayern
Definitely
Munich,
Barca have been, haven't they?
They're on the shirt sleeves of Bayern.
Oh, okay.
Qatar Airways specifically. Now, you've got to think all of these businesses are state-owned and so on. So they've had a heavy involvement in club-level football in Europe as well with the financing of it all. So to be getting closer and closer to the World Cup and it suddenly to become a problem, it's like, well, where have these voices been for so long? Because this is not a problem that's just happened now, but it's been happening for decades, you know? So I find it a little bit like all of a sudden, well, we should boycott the World Cup. We shouldn't have awarded it in the first place. Like, where was this conversation back then?
That's the obvious.
That's Friday's
we're going to come back to that,
right?
Friday. Yeah.
A little bit. So,
where should we start with this? I personally feel that the understanding of what's happening with migrant workers in the nation is a lot of people, it's human rights, but what actually is the issue? Are you aware of this Amnesty report from 2016 from Amnesty International, where they'd found 8 serious issues that were becoming a problem for workers' rights within Qatar? And as you'd already said, there's basically the current population of Qatar. The research I've done suggests to me that half the people who are in Qatar currently aren't from Qatar. They are actually half the population is people migrant working for the World Cup. It's an astonishing number. Just literally equate that and think half the population of your country would be here working on as migrant workers.
You know, you get a lot of international tournaments where you're running right to the wire on whether stadiums are going to be ready. We saw it with Brazil.
These are going to be no problem, but there's still cranes up and stuff.
No,
week to go.
But they've been ready for a while. But it's one of those problems where if you can throw 1 million people at it, you will be like, they have thrown a lot of labour at this to be ready on time and make sure that it's a fantastic showpiece. And interestingly, it will be a fantastic showpiece because they have the financial power to really put on a spectacular show. But the large part of it is migrant workers, the population, you're right.
Can I take you through these issues that Amnesty highlighted in 2016? Sure. So the 8 things they found was expensive recruitment fees for workers. So basically, in the first instance, these workers coming from primarily Nepal, Bangladesh and India were having to pay fees of between US $500 and $4,300 US dollars to actually get into the country and work in the first instance. Putting obviously these people in debt in the first instance.
Well, that's the interesting thing, putting them in debt. So they don't have it, right? So they're like, okay, well, you now, don't worry, your boss will pay, but you've got to pay your boss back. So now they've already got a hook in you, which is that, right, well, you owe me $4,000. I'm going to take it out of your wages in the first year or whatever. You got to work for them for a year. Yeah.
So obviously people getting in debt in the first instance, which that's not necessarily Qatar's problem. But one of the problems they found is obviously these people were having to pay to come and work in the country, getting promised a certain amount of wage and then getting there and the wage changed. Mm-hmm. This was common practice, and we're just getting... I listened to, I forget the young lady's name, did a fantastic podcast, Football Ramble, where she was speaking to this one gentleman who'd paid a load of money to obviously go and then work in the country. But then when he got there, like the wage was completely different. And he basically took a week to make the decision of what he was going to do. And his hands felt so tired that he felt, well, I've paid all this money to get it. I've got to get on with it. But then felt completely trapped in terms of couldn't get back out of the country. Their figures, by the way, in 2016 was 1.7 million migrant workers in Qatar, which was over 90% of the workforce in that nation. With 3,200 workers, mostly migrants, on the Khalifa Stadium was the one that Amnesty report particularly looked at. There were 230 plus men working Khalifa Stadium and the Aspire Zone, and they were abused and exploited. Some fallen victim to forced labour. I mentioned obviously the money they had to take out in the first instance. Some might have seen appalling living conditions. Was obviously highlighted as well, where I think by law you couldn't have in Qatar more than 4 per room, I think. But then in many rooms where these workers were staying, you was having 4 bunk beds. I'm talking about eight per room essentially, right? So we're talking about really poor living conditions. The lies about the salary as I said. So the idea that perhaps they'd be earning, say, $300 a month as an example, and then getting there and finding out it was only 190. I see the minimum wage had changed recently, but it was at one point where the minimum, I think, was the equivalent of like 99p an hour. Which, when you consider the riches of the country, this is, it's not like you're short of money. I mean, they have spent hundreds of, I think hundreds of billions, it's fair to say. I think I saw South Africa spent 3.5 billion in total for the 2010 World Cup, and Qatar's bill will range into the hundreds of billions, actually. Delayed salaries has been another problem, where obviously people are not just getting paid on time, essentially. One of the things that was put in place is, if you imagine you've got, Suj, so 1.7 million migrant workers in Qatar. I think Qatar's population, when they were awarded the tournament, was less than that number. So where are all these people going to live? So we've talked about the appalling living conditions, but in often, they've obviously been situated on stadium camps and not allowed to leave. Literally, you're in there, in your room, you go to work, you come out. They can't leave the country. They can't change jobs was another thing that was obviously highlighted. Being threatened. There's many stories, again, I highly recommend that Football Ramble podcast, where there were stories of workers literally fearing that they could not leave. There's stories that have been going around of people have complained about their rights, not getting paid on time, and they've just
get arrested, mate.
They've just been either arrested or deported. That's it. And there's no coming back from that. And there's obviously the forced labour. So obviously it's been well highlighted about moving the tournament from summer to winter, but you're not only building the stadiums in winter, right? You're building the stadiums all year round in some conditions which would be, for the average human, unbearable to walk down the street. Never mind.
Not
try
the
and
average. The majority of humans, you're
stadium.
talking about 40 to 50 degree heat is what the daytime temperature hits. And these guys are being forced to work through it.
Kamal, a Nepalese metal worker on the Khalifa Stadium, was told, the manager said, these men are causing trouble. They are lazy. Watch them closely. If they do not show up to work or try to escape, report them to the police. So rather than them feeling like, I can't carry on in these conditions and wanting to report their working conditions, they're actually more fearing that them being lazy is going to get them reported and to the police in that instant as well. So a lot of forced labour. The Guardian released a report where they'd looked at the number of migrant workers' deaths over the periods since construction of the World Cup started. That they couldn't ascertain that all of the workers' deaths were related to the building of football stadiums. It's not just stadiums, right? It's building of roads, etc. as well. 6,500 was the number of migrant workers' deaths that they believe have occurred in Qatar. 6,500 people lost their lives.
Because of things that could have been...
And many of them reported as heart failure and stuff. That goes back to a story we told about a young lady in Iran a couple of weeks ago as well. And that's to do with payoff compensation. And if it's down to heart failure and stuff, there's no cost for them, etc. There were a lot of rules and regulations brought in 2017 off the back of that Amnesty report to try and help workers. But there's one thing... saying that you're going to do something and there's another actually doing it. We talked about this kind of control situation. It's eased up in the United Arab Emirates. I need to double check now in Qatar, but they used to, for these migrant guys, you used to have to give your passport up when you started work. Like, give them your passport. That's why they can't leave the country, because the workers take their passports.
That's now stopped in Dubai. I'm not sure what the situation still is in Qatar, but imagine a situation where you landed and you're like, okay, you have to hand over your passport. Like, how trapped would you feel? It's incredibly trapped. There were laws and regulations brought in around this summer working. Like, you're not allowed to work between the hours of 12:30 and 3:30, but the majority of reports are that it was ignored and disregarded. You'll hear lots of anecdotal stories, and you probably don't hear as many as you would because people are fearful that they would, like, if the royal family were passing away, no one would do anything about it. And there are fines in place, James, for these companies if it is found that the death of a worker is as a result of heat-related conditions or work-related conditions or what have you. But if it's found that, and if it's something else, then these fines aren't getting actioned. And the problem is, I think, that there's window dressing for a lot of these rules for these migrant workers, but the reality on the ground is completely different. This is not new. This has been going on for ages, right? Dubai has popped up as a city with... you've not been there, have you?
Dubai's UAE, right?
UAE, United Arab Emirates. You've never been.
No.
Like, you drive and you see these like humongous, massive skyscrapers. I've probably been 3 times in the last 4 years, but only for 2 or 3 days at any given time. And you feel like every time you go back, there's more buildings, but you'll have a massive skyscraper next to a building site, skyscraper, building site. They're just building. Everything's just like you're building, and everything that you're building is like 60 stories high and all singing, all dancing, and yet still half the place isn't built. There's workers everywhere, mate, just building. I don't understand how they can have a need for so many buildings, but they do. The conditions are awful. To be working out in the heat, to be doing construction work and hard labour in 40-degree heat, you're not surprised that people will die because of those conditions.
When obviously they were awarded the tournament, they essentially only had one stadium. So the majority of the stadium, bar one, I think, the one where I think Liverpool won the Club World Cup, I want to say. All the rest are brand new builds.
Yeah, but they've been doing this for this has been the case since Dubai started becoming popular in the 90s and 80s and 90s and started getting built up. So migrant workers coming into the Middle East to do labour related jobs under these conditions has been a problem for years, decades.
Over the next month or so, a lot of us are going to enjoy football that we watch in these stadiums. And I think that doesn't sit well with me. I'm not saying I should sit here and watch football matches and necessarily be thinking about it, but there's so many things that are going to happen in the next month that I think are just going to make the average Joe like me feel quite uneasy if I actually sit back and remove myself from the football side of things and reflect and think what went on to build this stadium where I'm now enjoying this football match.
Yep. I agree.
And that just, if you sit down and think about that, that's why I can understand a lot of people are genuinely, I'm not going to be one of them, like I'm going to watch the football. But I understand the sentiment behind a lot of people who genuinely, I won't have anything to do with that. And it's not just the stadium, it's to do with LGBT rights and other things as well. But this will be part reason as well.
Yeah.
Whether compensation is going to be given to a lot of these migrant workers remains a source of frustration. There's a lot of lobbying from a lot of countries going on currently for FIFA to give a large share of the money that they make on this tournament back to migrant workers. And I think most people would strongly be in agreement of that happening.
I have zero trust that anything like that would actually happen.
Unfortunately, that's more a FIFA thing.
And it wouldn't be significant. The LGBTQ rights, we obviously know clearly that kind of is quite a religious based belief and rules and regulations around it. I completely disagree with any form of discrimination, and I don't think that you should have a tournament in a place where people can't be themselves. I think it's particularly difficult. At the same time, America were in competition with Qatar to host the World Cup, and they lost the bid despite Barack Obama's best efforts to try and get it there. They are lobbying hard against things like gay marriage, making it illegal in certain states. Not all of the country, but certain elements are lobbying hard against transgender rights and all of this kind of thing. And I don't feel like there would be the same uproar against America for their attitude towards these things as there is against Qatar. And these kind of LGBT rights have been a problem for a long time. I think they're wrong. But I don't think it's fair to just tarnish them with one brush. I think there's a lot of places in the world that are like that. I mean, we've seen a World Cup in Asia. We're talking about 99p an hour wages, right? China's no better. In the places that are making the iPhones that a lot of people are listening to this on and watching it, people are on ridiculous wages there.
How much do the football kits that you wear
exactly
costs
that.
to make, and how much are those people being paid for it?
Yeah. So I think it's wrong. I don't like the signage that's like come into don't do this, don't do that, don't do this, don't do that. But that's the way the country was in 2010 when it was awarded the World Cup. No one thought that between then and now that they were going to change their attitude towards everything.
Does the West, this is really touchy ground, does the West have the right to tell the Middle East how it should think and feel and behave?
No. I think as individuals...
And that's a wider question, not just related to LGBT.
I think as individuals, we have to make our own moral judgments on what our opinion is, right? But when it becomes a nation telling a nation how to behave, there's two ways of looking at it. On one side, you can look at it and say, get your house in order before you point fingers at us. And that's what a lot of people do.
That's a huge point.
But also do as I say, not as I do, because none of us are perfect. And just because let's just take, I don't know. Let's take someone who's a smoker, for example. Smoking's unhealthy. You know it's unhealthy, but that person might go to the gym and eat well and do whatever they can do to stay healthy. They might see someone who's unhealthy and say, you know what, mate, you shouldn't eat that burger and chips. You should have a chicken salad. They could turn around and say, well, you smoke, right? So why are you in a position to tell me how to be healthy? So I'm almost like, yeah, if you want to nitpick everything, no one has any moral ground to tell anyone how to behave ever at all, because there's plenty of things that I do that are unhealthy or wrong that means that should I never be able to tell anyone else how to do anything. You have to make your own moral compass for things. When there's pure hypocrisy, I find that particularly frustrating. Hypocrisy and double standards, where you're willing to point the finger at one nation for one thing, but not another at another. And I think we're getting more and more to the point where people have their own moral compass and they have to make their own moral decisions about what they think is right and what they don't. We have access to more information than we've ever had before.
And that's why, by the way, that's one big reason why this is being spoken about a lot more now than it was 12, 14 years ago.
We also have access to a lot more shit information than we've ever had before. And this is the other part of the problem. I don't think people that are looking at the human rights issues in Qatar are then going and looking back to the entire history of the nation and how the whole of the countries in the Middle East were founded and why they behave a certain way and understanding the cultural differences behind it. Like, I don't think people are really getting the full picture of it. This is part of the problem with YouTube. Even doing some research into stuff for this, I'm getting 5-8 minute news snippets, and I'm like, okay, all you've given me is like 20 different questions that I want to ask right now because I don't have access to that information. I understand the difficulties with women's rights, and then I hate to point the finger at America because it feels like I'm anti-America. Abortion's illegal now, or is on its way to being illegal in so many states. I'm like, well, you want women to have rights? Let them have rights, right? And that's just two very clear examples. There are other countries around the world where these issues exist, and it's not just football.
And here, I mean, this year we're coming into a winter and the Christmas period here, and we know we've got a major issue with employment, financial problems, homelessness. There's a lot of problems on our doorstep, right? Yeah. And we're not podding about that.
No.
Now, I realise that this essentially we're a football podcast, right? And we're going that way. And listen, we can explore homelessness and talk about that in the future as well. And I think that's why our focus is on this, because there's relation to football. Like, we'll talk about the cost of going to football and stuff as well. But to relate it back to home, like, we ain't perfect.
No, and football's not the only one with this problem. The other day I was watching UFC, is another passion of mine. I'm quite into the old UFC. Dana White, who's the president of UFC, is now talking about they want to take the UFC to different countries all around the world. It hasn't been in a lot of places. It's very American-centric with a few other countries. He wants to take it to Africa, right? And they were talking about, well, yeah, cool. Okay, there hasn't been, like, the same way that there hadn't been a World Cup in Africa, we take it to South Africa. There hasn't been UFC in Africa. Let's take it to Africa. There's a lot of fans there. He wants to go to Nigeria, and they might have to build a stadium there because they don't have the facility necessarily. Is what the kind of talk is. plenty of human rights issues there. Like you've talked all the kidnapping of women and use in the sex trade and all this kind of stuff. Kids, not just women, girls, right? At a young age, yet they're talking about taking the event there. No one's going to, I say no one's going to, I'm sure people will ask questions, and it'll be the minority of voices that will talk about, should that be happening? Are there better places that you can take these kind of sporting events? Unfortunately, everywhere, James, has issues and problems. The scale of them varies depending on the country that you go to. We've had kind of slave labour issues with the cockle workers in Morecambe that time when they drowned the Chinese immigrant workers and what have you. So many countries now built on migrant work, and so many countries have religious or culturally ingrained views within them now that it becomes more and more difficult. It's a very, very tricky situation. I, like you, the more I look at it, the more uncomfortable I feel the closer we get to the World Cup. And it's 50%.
I thought I'd feel different after the Premier League finished. And thinking, right, it's Monday now. I haven't got to think about the Premier League for 6 weeks. Right, let me really look forward to this tournament. And the way I've felt over the last 24 hours has made me feel more distant to it rather than to it. Now, admittedly, been doing a lot of reading about stuff like this, which probably isn't going to help.
No.
But I don't feel like, I'm in World Cup buzz now.
I think for me, 50% of my meh towards it is this. And 50% is what we're going to discuss on Friday, which is FIFA and the whole.
I thought you were going to say England are shit.
No. And it's not to do with who I got in the World Cup sweepstake either. But
I tell them who I got, because I told them last week who I'd get.
Wales.
This is so obvious.
I got Morocco. I don't think both of us are in with a chance, mate. But 50% is to do with the financial stuff that is on FIFA Uncovered that we're going to be looking at as well, and the way that the tournament was awarded. And money in football is just frustrates the hell out of me with how immoral it can be sometimes and corrupt. And yeah, it's kind of, you're watching, but you know that it's all artificial and fake anyway. Like even the other week, it was Kieran Maguire and Kevin were talking about it on the Prize of Football. Manchester City's financial results came out. The best year on record, double the revenues of any other Premier League club. Revenues or profits? It was double in one of the two of them. You just look at it and you're like, this isn't artificially inflated. Like, how are you and I going to compete?
I've seen a lot over 8xBet mentioned over the last 2 weeks. Did we do that 2 months ago?
Doubled down on off the back of Fulham's recent issues, and fair play to the fans for standing up. All of these things are chipping away at me and my love of the sport, I think. And it's fine. I'm going to watch it, but I know that like eventually you get to the point where you used to watch WWE wrestling and you know it's cool and it's entertaining, but it's a little bit fake, and you know it's fake, but you'll still participate anyway.
Never tell a wrestler that it's fake.
They're athletes, don't get me wrong, but they ain't getting smashed in the head with a chair properly. It's that artificialness of it all is kind of increasing a little bit here.
In 2010, just on LGBT, one of FIFA's own governing statutes that was in force at the time, there was that there could not be any discrimination of any kind against any group of people, and they still awarded Qatar that World Cup. It's not a new legislation. They've not kind of had a backlash where it's, in 2016, this Amnesty report, and they've gone, we need to put this into our values. It was there. It was there in 2010. They chose to ignore it. In Qatar, being LGBT essentially can get you imprisonment up to 7 years. There have been rumours and little more than that it could even be a death penalty. As far as I can find, no one has ever been killed in Qatar for specifically, not by, listen, there could have been stoning and stuff like that led to death, but no one's actually been given a death sentence as such. But still openly, we're looking at this and going, you could get imprisoned for 7 years. Now, all you'll hear, and I've said this numerous times, all you'll get from them is everyone is welcome. The rights for LGBT members of those that live in Qatar are extremely dangerous. I don't think that if LGBT groups want to go there, I don't think they're gonna come into much trouble, because I think a little bit like what we said with Russia, they'll be open the doors, show everything in the great light for the next month, and then it will go back to what it is afterwards.
Correct.
I think. However, if I was LGBT, I wouldn't be considering going there for a moment.
No, I'm with you. Don't put yourself in the situation where you even open yourself up. And I feel horrible saying it, but it's more for the health and safety of the people that are part of the community rather than trying to stand up for anything. First and foremost, I want you to be all right. I don't want you to be arrested or go through anything. And you can argue, like, you got to stand up for your rights, but it's just not worth it. Look after yourselves first. We've talked about on previous pods as well, on the People's Poll, about what should the players do in terms of the armband that Wales are going to wear. We've now seen Denmark's third kit's all black, no sponsors, no nothing, as a kind of sign. Australia's team have put out a video talking about the issues around the rights. I think we will see teams, Robert Lewandowski spoke about it a little bit as well, didn't he? I think a few players and teams are making small gestures. I think they're doing what they can without overstepping the mark.
Gianni Infantino wrote to everybody, didn't write to me and Suj, by the way, saying, don't make this about politics, make it about football now. So you've had the head of FIFA's written, because they know what's coming in terms of the backlash and all this thing getting raised. They've written to everybody basically saying, shut up.
Great.
It's awful. And I think it's really disappointing from Infantino, because it's not his fault that the tournament is in Qatar.
No,
that's under Blatter's regime and stuff, right? I guess he's caught between a rock and a hard place. He doesn't, because he's going to need to be in the tournament, etc. Probably fearing for his own life if he speaks out against them and stuff. But that letter didn't need to go to nations, because I think nations have the right to express how they feel. And show support for groups who need it, etc. No one should ever go anywhere in the world and feel like they can't be themselves, is my own personal opinion. I do agree that there is a line here where it's not like, this is obviously a religious belief that's been there for a really long time, and it kind of feels treading on toes. My take would be I wouldn't go there, but a lot of our people, obviously, the teams have to go there.
Correct.
And there'd be gay footballers playing.
Correct.
That's a certainty, right? Not going to be 32 teams. If anybody thinks, there's no gay footballers at the World Cup, yeah, there will be. We just don't know who they are. Gary Lineker had said very recently, didn't he? He knows of 2 openly gay players and hopes they would come out during the tournament. I mean, that's up to them. It's not up to Gary Lineker to say that, would be my own personal opinion. But no one should ever go anywhere and feel like they can't be themselves. I think, by all means, what I would say is, and it is important to say, that if you are going to Qatar, do respect some of the cultural things they obviously have there and stuff. I think, for example, if they'd have said alcohol is something, there's no need for us really to speak about it. There's a real big row going on at the moment with Budweiser, where suddenly they've decided they want to move to tents at the last minute. But if they'd have said, right, the alcohol's illegal in Qatar, there's no alcohol, my take on that would be, well, fine. Do I need alcohol in my life? No. That's not changing who I am as an individual or as a person. And I think whether you're straight, you're gay, whatever, public displays of affection probably aren't necessarily advisable, because it's just culturally not necessarily what's normal out there. But who you are in private, I think you should be able to be who you are in private, surely.
Listeners, I hope you enjoyed this episode of the People's Poll. We want your comments, ideas, thoughts.
In the People's Poll, I didn't let anybody vote on this.
Well, yeah, I know, but it is kind of a People's Poll. It's a rigged People's Poll. Even our elections, James, can be a little bit dodgy sometimes, but we needed to do this episode for sure. Jump on Twitter, jump in the conversation. Happy to kind of understand everybody's opinions and keep the conversation going, because I do think that's the most important piece of this. On Friday, we'll be looking much more at the technical side of FIFA and the awarding of the World Cup and that murky side of things as well. Tomorrow, though, James, we're back at you with Sky Fantasy Football, a wrap-up of the first half of the season. Overhaul is obviously clearly open now. And we'll be looking a little bit towards the Sky World Cup game as well.
Way more towards the World Cup side of it.
10 grand in the house. But in the meantime, stay safe. Ciao for now.
Thanks, everyone. Be nice to each other. Cue music, please, man, child.